The prosecutor's hand froze mid-gesture, her pen clattering to the marble floor as 3-year-old Grace Elizabeth Anderson walked past the defendant's table toward the massive German shepherd sitting quietly by the witness stand. The child wasn't supposed to speak to the therapy dog about her mother's brutal assault case. Judge Catherine Sullivan's coffee cup slipped from her weathered fingers, shattering against the bench as Grace knelt beside Sergeant Major Rex and whispered words that made the courtroom's air turn electric. "Rex, tell them what really happened to Daddy." Court reporter Margaret Chen's fingers stopped typing mid-word, her mouth falling open as murmurs erupted from the packed gallery like a dam bursting. Defense attorney Marcus Webb's face drained of all color, his expensive briefcase tumbling from his lap as he shot to his feet. This trial was about Sarah Anderson's near-fatal beating 6 months ago, not about Officer Jim Anderson's suspicious car accident 2 years prior that left his daughter mute and his widow struggling with 3 jobs and unpaid insurance claims. "Order!" Judge Sullivan's gavel cracked like thunder, but her voice trembled. What did this child know that 12 months of investigation had missed? And why was the defense attorney looking like he'd seen a ghost? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 2 years had passed since Officer Jim Anderson's patrol car skidded off Highway 101 on a rain-slicked November night, leaving behind a 3-year-old daughter who stopped speaking, and a 26-year-old widow drowning in bills that insurance money should have covered. Grace Elizabeth, Gracie Anderson, had been the light of her father's life, a chattering toddler who would wait by the window each evening for his squad car to pull into their modest driveway in Millbrook, California. Now she sat silent in Riverside County's packed courtroom, her blonde curls framing a face that had learned too early that the world could steal everything precious without warning. The pale yellow dress with tiny daisies, purchased second-hand from the church rummage sale, was the nicest thing she owned, saved for this moment when her testimony might finally bring justice for what happened to her mother 6 months ago. Sarah Beth Anderson worked 3 jobs to keep their small apartment, cleaning office buildings from midnight to 6, stocking shelves at Patterson's Grocery from 7 to 3, and caring for elderly Mrs. Henderson from 4 to 8. The medical bills from her brutal assault had already consumed their meager savings, and the unpaid life insurance claim from Jim's death hung over them like a storm cloud that never broke. Sergeant Major Rex represented everything Grace had lost and desperately needed. The 9-year-old German shepherd's black and tan coat gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, his intelligent brown eyes holding depths of understanding that came from his own experience with loss. Rex had served 8 years alongside Officer Daniel Patterson before his partner succumbed to pancreatic cancer, leaving the dog so devastated that he refused to work with anyone else on the force. 76-year-old Rose Patterson, Daniel's widow, had taken Rex in during his grief, recognizing a kindred spirit in the mourning dog. Her small house on Elm Street became Rex's sanctuary, where he slept beside Daniel's combat boots and waited for a purpose that seemed lost forever. When the court system requested a therapy animal for Grace's testimony, Rex had shown his first spark of interest in months. Judge Catherine Sullivan adjusted her reading glasses and studied the case file that would mark her final trial before retirement. At 68, she had presided over 4 decades of human tragedy. But none had haunted her like the unsolved murder of her 4-year-old granddaughter 15 years prior. Emily Sullivan had been killed during a domestic violence incident that authorities never fully solved, leaving Catherine with questions that aged her more than time ever could. Defense attorney Marcus Webb straightened his silk tie and reviewed his notes one final time. At 45, he had built his reputation defending the defenseless, taking pro bono cases that other lawyers avoided. His expensive suit and Rolex seemed out of place for someone claiming to work for free, but his gentle demeanor with Grace had convinced everyone of his genuine concern for the traumatized child. The afternoon sun streamed through tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across faces that would soon learn that some secrets are too heavy for little girls to carry alone. The trial had begun 3 days earlier with Sarah Anderson's heart-wrenching testimony from her hospital bed, transmitted via video link because doctors deemed her too fragile to travel. Her voice, still hoarse from the breathing tube that had saved her life, painted a picture of terror that left the jury visibly shaken. She described waking to find Richard Morrison, her ex-boyfriend, standing over her bed with a baseball bat, his face twisted with rage over money she supposedly owed him. "I tried to run," Sarah whispered to the camera, her bruised face barely recognizable as the vibrant young woman from family photos. "But he caught me in the kitchen. That's when Gracie—" Her voice broke completely. "That's when my baby saw everything." Morrison sat stone-faced at the defendant's table, his public defender looking overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence against his client. The prosecution had presented photographs of the crime scene that made several jurors turn away: shattered dishes, blood spatter across yellow kitchen walls, and a child's drawing scattered on the floor where Grace had been coloring when the violence erupted. But the case hinged entirely on Grace's testimony, and for 2 years the little girl had been locked in silence so complete that child psychologists wondered if she would ever speak again. Dr. Jennifer Martinez had worked with Grace for 18 months, using art therapy and play therapy to reach the traumatized child, but progress remained agonizingly slow. Grace exhibits classic symptoms of selective mutism following severe trauma, Dr. Martinez had explained to the court. The mind protects itself by shutting down the very mechanism that might put the child in further danger, their voice. That's when someone suggested Rex. Rose Patterson had been attending the trial daily, her arthritis making the courthouse steps a challenge she conquered through sheer determination. When she overheard prosecutors discussing their dilemma, she approached them with a proposal that seemed born of desperation rather than logic. "Rex hasn't worked since my Daniel passed," she told Prosecutor Rebecca Sterling in the courthouse hallway, "but that dog has a gift for reading people, especially those who are hurting. If anyone can reach that precious child, it's him." The legal precedent was virtually non-existent. Therapy animals in courtrooms remained controversial, with defense attorneys arguing they unfairly influenced juries through emotional manipulation. But Judge Sullivan, perhaps thinking of her own granddaughter's silenced voice, had agreed to allow Rex's presence during Grace's testimony. The morning Rex first encountered Grace, something extraordinary happened in the courthouse's victim services room. Grace had been coloring with her usual methodical precision, always staying within the lines, always choosing muted colors, when Rex padded quietly into the room behind Rose. The child looked up from her drawing, and for the first time in months, her expression shifted from blank acceptance to something resembling curiosity. Rex approached slowly, his training evident in every measured step. He sat precisely 3 feet from Grace's chair and simply waited, his brown eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed almost human. Minutes passed in silence before Grace set down her crayon and extended one small hand toward the magnificent animal. The moment her fingers touched Rex's fur, the dog's entire body relaxed in a way Rose hadn't seen since Daniel's death. Grace stroked his head with the tentative wonder of a child discovering magic, and Rex leaned into her touch as if he had found his purpose again. "Good boy," Grace whispered, so softly that Rose nearly convinced herself she had imagined it. But she hadn't imagined it, and neither had the court officer who witnessed the moment and immediately called Judge Sullivan. That afternoon, legal motions flew as both sides prepared arguments for and against allowing Rex to accompany Grace during testimony. Marcus Webb had been surprisingly supportive of the arrangement, arguing that anything helping Grace feel comfortable enough to testify served the interests of justice. His compassionate response earned approving nods from spectators and reinforced his reputation as a defender who truly cared about victims. "Your Honor," Webb had argued eloquently, "if this child has found her voice through connection with this remarkable animal, then we have a moral obligation to honor that connection. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice silenced is justice destroyed." The prosecution agreed enthusiastically, seeing Rex as their best hope for unlocking Grace's testimony. Only the victim's rights advocate expressed concerns about potential re-traumatization, but even she conceded that traditional methods had failed. Judge Sullivan's decision was unanimous and immediate. Rex would be allowed to remain with Grace during her testimony, setting a precedent that would ripple through family courts nationwide. Now, as Grace knelt beside Rex in the courtroom and whispered words that stopped time itself, everyone present realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a legal innovation. They were watching a child reclaim her voice through the unwavering loyalty of an animal who understood loss, trauma, and the healing power of unconditional love. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a taut wire ready to snap as Grace's words hung in the air. "Rex, tell them what really happened to Daddy." Judge Sullivan's gavel remained frozen in her hand, her 40 years of judicial experience providing no precedent for this moment. The child's reference to her father's death had blindsided everyone. This trial was supposed to be about Sarah Anderson's assault, not the 2-year-old car accident that had claimed Officer Jim Anderson's life. Marcus Webb's face had gone ashen, his confident demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. He fumbled with his briefcase, papers scattering as his hands trembled in a way that didn't escape the sharp eyes of court reporter Margaret Chen. She had seen hundreds of attorneys over her 20-year career, and Webb's reaction struck her as profoundly wrong for someone who should have been surprised but professionally composed. "Your Honor," Webb stammered, rising unsteadily, "I must object to this line of testimony. The child is clearly confused and—" "Overruled," Judge Sullivan said sharply, her voice cutting through Webb's protests like a blade. Something in her seasoned intuition was screaming that this moment mattered more than any legal technicality. "The court will hear what the child has to say." Grace looked up at Rex with absolute trust, her small hands buried in his thick fur. The German Shepherd's behavior had shifted dramatically. His ears were forward, his body alert, and his brown eyes were fixed on Webb with an intensity that made several jurors shift uncomfortably. Rose Patterson, watching from the gallery, recognized the look immediately. It was the same expression Rex had worn during his working days when he detected something dangerous. "Rex remembers," Grace said quietly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He was there the night Daddy's car got broken." Prosecutor Rebecca Sterling felt her pulse quicken. Jim Anderson's accident had been investigated thoroughly, or so she had thought. The official report cited driver error during heavy rain, with no evidence of foul play. But as she watched Webb's increasingly agitated state, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began forming in her mind. "Grace," Rebecca said gently, approaching the witness stand, "can you tell us what Rex remembers about that night?" The little girl closed her eyes and leaned against Rex's solid warmth. When she opened them again, they held a clarity that seemed impossible for someone so young. The man with the shiny watch pushed Daddy's car off the road. Rex and his daddy came to help, but it was too late. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped and whispered frantically while reporters scribbled notes with barely contained excitement. Webb shot to his feet again, his face now flushed red above his pale collar. "This is preposterous. The child is having delusions, possibly influenced by—" "Mr. Webb," Judge Sullivan's voice cracked like a whip. "You will sit down and remain silent until I call for your objections." But it was Rex's reaction that truly commanded attention. The moment Webb had raised his voice, the German shepherd had positioned himself protectively between Grace and the defense attorney, his hackles slightly raised. More telling still, he was staring directly at Webb's wrist, at the distinctive Rolex Submariner that caught the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Rose Patterson felt her heart skip a beat. She remembered now. Daniel had come home agitated the night of Jim Anderson's accident, muttering about something that didn't feel right about the crash scene. He had mentioned a man in an expensive suit who had arrived before the police, claiming to be a concerned citizen. Daniel had noted the man's watch because it seemed incongruous for someone to be wearing a $5,000 Rolex while supposedly out for a late-night walk in the rain. Daniel wrote notes, Rose whispered to herself, her mind racing. Her husband had been meticulous about documentation, especially when something bothered him about a case. If those notes still existed. Meanwhile, Grace continued her testimony with the unwavering certainty of a child who had no reason to lie. Rex's daddy told him something was wrong. The car didn't slip, it got pushed. The man with the shiny watch was there first, before the police cars came. Rebecca Sterling's legal training warred with her instincts. Everything about this should have been inadmissible. Hearsay testimony from a traumatized child about events she couldn't have witnessed firsthand. But the specificity of Grace's details, combined with Webb's increasingly erratic behavior, suggested something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. "Your Honor," Rebecca said carefully, "I request a brief recess to investigate these new allegations." Judge Sullivan nodded grimly. "Granted. Court will reconvene in 2 hours." As the courtroom began to empty, Webb remained seated, his hands clenched so tightly around his pen that his knuckles had turned white. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, watching a 3-year-old child and a therapy dog unravel what he had believed was the perfect crime. Grace remained on the witness stand, one small hand resting on Rex's head as if drawing strength from their connection. She seemed unaware of the chaos her words had unleashed, focused only on the gentle breathing of the dog who had somehow given her the courage to speak truths that had been buried for 2 years. "Good boy, Rex," she whispered, echoing the words her father used to say. "Good boy for remembering." In the gallery, Rose Patterson was already reaching for her cell phone, her arthritis forgotten in her urgency to get home and search through Daniel's old case files. If her husband had documented his suspicions about Jim Anderson's death, those notes might be the key to unlocking a conspiracy that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the dark secrets beginning to surface in what everyone had thought was a simple domestic violence case. The 2-hour recess stretched into the longest afternoon of Rebecca Sterling's prosecutorial career. While Judge Sullivan sequestered the jury and cleared the courtroom of media, Rebecca found herself in the unprecedented position of investigating a potential murder that had been classified as an accident for 2 years. Her first call went to Detective Ray Hoffman, the lead investigator on Jim Anderson's case, who arrived at the courthouse within 30 minutes, looking skeptical and slightly annoyed. "Rebecca, with all due respect, we investigated that accident thoroughly," Hoffman said, spreading the original case files across the prosecutor's conference table. "Rain-slicked roads, visibility near zero. Anderson was working a double shift and probably fell asleep at the wheel. It's tragic, but it's not mysterious." But as they reviewed the files together, details that had seemed routine 2 years ago now appeared suspicious in light of Grace's testimony. The first responder log showed that Marcus Webb had indeed been on scene before official personnel arrived, claiming he had witnessed the accident while driving home from a late business meeting. His statement described seeing Anderson's patrol car skid off the highway, but he provided no details about attempting to help or calling for emergency services. "Look at this," Rebecca pointed to Webb's witness statement. "He says he saw the car go off the road, but he never mentions stopping to render aid. What kind of person witnesses a police officer's car crash and doesn't immediately try to help?" Detective Hoffman frowned as he read Webb's account more carefully. "And his timeline is off. He claims he called 911 at 11:47 p.m., but the first emergency call came from a trucker at 11:52. If Webb was really there first, why didn't he call immediately?" Meanwhile, across town, Rose Patterson was conducting her own investigation in the cluttered basement of her small house on Elm Street. Daniel had been obsessive about his case files, especially those that troubled him, and she remembered his agitation the night Jim Anderson died. Among boxes of police reports and evidence logs, she found Daniel's personal notebook, the leather-bound journal where he recorded his thoughts about cases that didn't sit right with him. The entry dated November 15th, 2 years ago, made her hands tremble. "Responded to Anderson crash on Highway 101. Something off about the whole scene. Skid marks don't match weather conditions. Too short for the speed he supposedly was going. Civilian on scene, attorney Marcus Webb. Claims he witnessed accident, but his story keeps changing. First he said he saw the car skid. Then he said he just found it after it went off the road. His expensive suit was bone dry despite heavy rain. Need to follow up, but captain says case is closed." The next entry, dated 3 days later, was even more disturbing. Asked Anderson's widow about insurance policy. Webb handling the claim as family friend, but Sarah never mentioned knowing him before the accident. Policy worth $500K. But Webb says payout delayed due to investigation irregularities. Doesn't add up. Going to dig deeper, but Rex seems sick. Vet appointment tomorrow. Rose realized with growing horror that Daniel had suspected foul play from the beginning, but his cancer diagnosis had derailed his investigation. The entries stopped abruptly after his first chemotherapy treatment, when fighting for his own life became his only priority. Back at the courthouse, Rebecca was making her own disturbing discoveries. A record search revealed that Marcus Webb had handled insurance claims for 4 other police widows in the past 5 years, all involving officers who had died in seemingly accidental circumstances. In each case, the insurance payouts had been delayed by months or even years due to procedural complications that Webb claimed to be resolving pro bono. "This is starting to look like a pattern," Detective Hoffman admitted grimly. 4 dead cops, 4 delayed insurance claims, and Webb connected to all of them. The most shocking revelation came when they cross-referenced Webb's financial records. Despite claiming to work pro bono for struggling families, Webb had made several large deposits into offshore accounts over the past 5 years. Deposits that coincided suspiciously with the dates when insurance companies would have paid out death benefits to the officers' families. When court reconvened at 4 p.m., the atmosphere had changed completely. Webb sat rigid at the defense table, his earlier composure replaced by barely concealed panic. Judge Sullivan called both attorneys to the bench for a private conference that lasted 20 minutes, during which Webb's complexion grew increasingly pale. Grace remained on the witness stand, her small hand never leaving Rex's head. The German Shepherd seemed to sense the tension in the room, his protective stance even more pronounced than before. When Judge Sullivan finally returned to her seat, her expression was grave. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge began, "in light of new evidence that has come to light during our recess, this court must address allegations that extend beyond the scope of the original charges against Mr. Morrison." Rebecca approached the witness stand again, her voice gentle but purposeful. "Grace, Can you tell us more about the man with the shiny watch? Did you ever see him before the night your daddy died? Grace nodded solemnly. He came to our house. Daddy was at work and Mommy was crying about money. The man said he would help with the insurance, but he made Mommy sign papers that made her cry more. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Grace continued, her words delivered with the devastating honesty that only children possess. Rex remembers him because he smelled like lies. Dogs know when people aren't telling the truth. Webb finally cracked. "This is insane," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "You're going to convict a man based on the fantasies of a 3-year-old and the supposed memories of a dog?" But his outburst only served to confirm what everyone was beginning to suspect. Judge Sullivan's voice was ice cold as she responded. "Mr. Webb, you will control yourself in my courtroom. Continue, Miss Anderson." Grace looked directly at Webb for the first time since her testimony began. Her young face showed no fear, only the quiet certainty of truth. "Rex says you took our money. You took all the daddy's money and made their families sad." The revelation that shattered the last of Webb's composure came when Rose Patterson entered the courtroom, Daniel's notebook clutched in her arthritic hands. As she made her way to the prosecutor's table, Webb's face went completely white. He knew exactly what that notebook contained, and he knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Rebecca took the notebook with reverence, understanding immediately its significance. "Your Honor, I have new evidence that corroborates the child's testimony and suggests a conspiracy involving insurance fraud and possibly multiple homicides." As Rebecca began reading Daniel Patterson's suspicions aloud, Webb made a desperate calculation. He could continue fighting and face certain exposure, or he could attempt to minimize the damage by controlling the narrative. But as he looked at Grace's unwavering gaze and Rex's protective stance, he realized that his fate had been sealed the moment a traumatized child found her voice through the loyalty of a dog who remembered everything. The courtroom held its collective breath as Webb slowly rose from his chair. His expensive suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if the weight of his guilt had physically diminished him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I need to speak with my attorney about potentially changing my plea." But Grace wasn't finished. As Webb began to sit down, she called out one final devastating truth. "Rex says you hurt more than just the daddies. You hurt the other children, too, the ones whose daddies didn't come home." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the solving of a crime, but the triumph of innocence over evil achieved through the unbreakable bond between a child and the dog who had given her the courage to speak for all the victims who no longer could. The courthouse erupted into controlled chaos as Webb's admission sent shockwaves through the packed gallery. Reporters frantically scribbled notes while family members of other deceased officers leaned forward in their seats, suddenly understanding that their own losses might not have been the accidents they'd been told. Judge Sullivan's gavel rang out repeatedly as she struggled to maintain order in a courtroom that had just witnessed the unraveling of what appeared to be a massive criminal conspiracy. Webb sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, while his court-appointed co-counsel whispered urgently in his ear. The defense attorney looked overwhelmed, clearly unprepared for his client's case to pivot from defending against assault charges to damage control for potential mass murder. Meanwhile, Grace remained calm on the witness stand, her small hand stroking Rex's fur as if the dog's presence shielded her from the chaos surrounding them. Rebecca Sterling felt her heart racing as the implications of Grace's testimony became clear. If Webb had indeed orchestrated Jim Anderson's death and potentially others, they were looking at one of the most sophisticated insurance fraud schemes in California history. She quickly requested another recess to consult with federal investigators, knowing that crimes of this magnitude would require resources beyond the county prosecutor's office. During the 30-minute break, FBI agent Maria Santos arrived with a team of forensic accountants who had been tracking suspicious insurance payouts across multiple jurisdictions. Agent Santos, a 20-year veteran of white-collar crime investigations, took one look at Webb's financial records and immediately recognized the pattern. "We've been investigating similar cases in 3 other states," Santos explained to Rebecca and Detective Hoffman. "Always the same M.O. Police officers die in suspicious accidents, insurance payouts get delayed or diverted, and the families never receive their full benefits. We suspected a connection, but couldn't prove it until now." The most damning evidence came from Webb's own files, which investigators had seized during the recess. Among his papers, they found detailed dossiers on dozens of police officers across California, complete with their work schedules, family financial situations, and insurance policy details. The files read like a hunter's guide, identifying officers who were vulnerable due to financial stress or family problems. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Judge Sullivan's face was grim as she addressed the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, what began as a domestic violence trial has uncovered evidence of crimes that extend far beyond the scope of these proceedings. However, we will continue with Miss Anderson's testimony to ensure that all relevant information is preserved for the record." Grace looked up at Rebecca with the trust that only children can show, her blue eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. When Rebecca asked her to continue describing what Rex remembered, Grace's response chilled everyone present. "Rex says the man with the shiny watch wasn't alone," Grace said quietly. "There were other people who helped him hurt the daddies. They made it look like accidents. But Rex's nose knows the truth." Webb's composure finally shattered completely. He lurched to his feet, his face red with desperation and rage. "This is insane. You're destroying my life based on the word of a child who talks to dogs. She can't possibly know what she's saying." But his outburst only served to confirm everyone's growing suspicions. Rex immediately positioned himself between Webb and Grace, his protective instincts fully activated. The German Shepherd's low growl filled the silent courtroom, a sound that spoke of loyalty and justice in ways that human words could not express. Judge Sullivan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Webb, you will sit down immediately or you will be removed from this courtroom in restraints." As Webb reluctantly took his seat, Grace continued her devastating testimony. "The bad man took money from all the families whose daddies went to heaven. He made the mommies sign papers when they were too sad to understand. Rex says that's why my mommy had to work so many jobs, because our money never came home." The revelation hit Sarah Anderson's case like a thunderbolt. Rebecca quickly cross-referenced the insurance files and discovered that Sarah's 3 jobs and financial struggles weren't just the result of losing her husband's income. They were the direct result of Webb's systematic theft of her family's insurance benefits. The $500,000 policy that should have secured Grace's future had been diverted into Webb's offshore accounts through a series of fraudulent legal maneuvers. Agent Santos approached the bench with additional evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture. "Your Honor, our preliminary investigation suggests that Mr. Webb has been operating this scheme for at least 7 years. We've identified at least 12 police officers whose deaths now require reinvestigation, and potentially dozens of families who have been defrauded of millions in insurance benefits." The scope of Webb's crimes began to overwhelm everyone present. This wasn't just about Jim Anderson's death or Sarah's assault. It was about a predator who had systematically targeted the families of fallen officers, stealing from those who had already paid the ultimate price for public service. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As federal agents continued their real-time investigation, they discovered that Webb's criminal network extended beyond insurance fraud. Several of the accidental deaths he had arranged were police officers who had been investigating corruption within their own departments. Jim Anderson, it turned out, had been looking into discrepancies in evidence handling that might have exposed Webb's criminal associates. "Your Honor," Agent Santos announced, "Officer Anderson was not a random victim. He was specifically targeted because his investigation threatened to expose a corruption network that includes several high-ranking officials." The courtroom fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Webb hadn't just been stealing insurance money, he had been eliminating threats to a criminal organization that had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels. Grace's father had died, not in a random accident, but as a targeted assassination designed to protect corrupt officials and their criminal partners. Grace seemed to sense the gravity of what her testimony had unleashed. She looked around the courtroom with the solemnity of someone far older than her years, then spoke directly to Judge Sullivan. "Judge Lady," she said in her clear, small voice, "Rex wants everyone to know that my daddy was a good policeman. He tried to catch the bad people, and that's why they hurt him. But Rex says the truth always comes out when good people don't give up." The simplicity and power of her words brought tears to eyes throughout the courtroom. Here was a child who had lost everything, her father, her family's security, her mother's health, yet still believed in justice and truth. Her faith in goodness, expressed through her connection with Rex, had exposed a criminal conspiracy that might otherwise have continued destroying lives for years to come. Webb's world collapsed in real time as investigators continued uncovering evidence of his crimes. Bank records, phone logs, and encrypted communications painted a picture of a man who had perverted his position as a defender of justice into a tool for exploitation and murder. The very families he claimed to help pro bono had been his primary victims, their grief and confusion making them easy targets for his sophisticated frauds. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Sullivan faced an unprecedented situation. What had begun as a straightforward domestic violence case had evolved into a federal investigation involving organized crime, police corruption, and multiple homicides. Yet, at the center of it all remained a 3-year-old girl and her therapy dog, whose unshakable bond had given voice to truths that powerful criminals had worked years to bury. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Grace finally stepped down from the witness stand. Rex walked beside her with the dignity of a soldier who had completed his mission, his loyalty to both Grace and the memory of his fallen partner having served a justice larger than any human court could dispense. But even as this victory emerged, everyone present sensed that the story was far from over. Webb's arrest would be just the beginning of unraveling a criminal network that had operated in the shadows for years, and Grace's courage in speaking the truth would likely be needed again as investigators worked to bring all the perpetrators to justice. The devastating blow came at 6:47 p.m., just as the courthouse was finally clearing of media and investigators. Rebecca Sterling was reviewing evidence files when her phone rang with news that shattered the day's triumph into 1,000 pieces. Sarah Anderson had crashed in the hospital, her body finally succumbing to complications from the brutal assault that had started this entire legal odyssey. "She's in surgery now," Dr. Patricia Vance explained over the crackling phone connection. "Internal bleeding we thought we had under control. Her body just gave up. The stress of today's revelations, learning about her husband's murder, it was too much for someone in her condition." Rebecca felt the world tilt sideways. Grace was about to lose the only parent she had left, just hours after finding the courage to expose her father's killers. The cruel irony was unbearable. The child's bravery in seeking justice might have cost her the very person she was trying to protect. At the hospital, Grace sat in the pediatric waiting room with Rex pressed against her side, somehow understanding that her mother was fighting for her life down the hall. Rose Patterson held the little girl's free hand, her own arthritis forgotten in the face of this unimaginable tragedy. The elderly woman's faith, tested by decades of loss, struggled against the possibility that God would take another parent from this innocent child. "Rex," Grace whispered into the dog's fur, her voice barely audible. "Mommy's gonna go be with Daddy, isn't she?" The German shepherd whined softly, a sound that conveyed more comfort than any human words could offer. His brown eyes, which had seen so much loss in his own life, reflected an understanding that transcended species. Rex had watched his partner, Officer Patterson, waste away from cancer, had felt the helplessness of loving someone you cannot save. Judge Sullivan arrived at the hospital still wearing her robes, having rushed from the courthouse the moment she heard the news. At 68, she had presided over countless family tragedies, but none had affected her as deeply as watching this child face the prospect of total abandonment. The parallels to her own granddaughter's case were inescapable. Another innocent child left vulnerable by a system that had failed to protect those who needed it most. "How long has she been in surgery?" Judge Sullivan asked Dr. Vance, though she dreaded the answer. 3 hours now. The internal injuries were more extensive than we initially realized, combined with the emotional trauma from today's proceedings. Dr. Vance's voice trailed off, leaving the implications unspoken, but understood. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb sat in a holding cell downtown, finally comprehending the full scope of destruction his crimes had caused. FBI agent Santos had confronted him with the timeline. Sarah's assault had been orchestrated as a warning to keep her quiet about the insurance money, but Richard Morrison had exceeded his instructions. What was supposed to be intimidation had become attempted murder, and now the complications from that assault might claim another victim. Webb's criminal network was unraveling rapidly as investigators traced connections that extended far beyond insurance fraud. Police corruption, witness intimidation, and now, potentially 3 murders: Jim Anderson, possibly Sarah, and the other officers whose accidents were being reinvestigated. The scope of the conspiracy grew with each passing hour. Back in the hospital waiting room, Grace's composure began to crack as the hours stretched on. The 3-year-old who had shown such remarkable courage in the courtroom was, ultimately, still a little girl who needed her mother. She climbed into Rose Patterson's lap, clutching Rex's collar as if the dog were her only anchor to a world that kept taking everything she loved. "I want my mommy," Grace sobbed, the words muffled against Rose's shoulder. "I don't want to be alone like Rex was when his daddy died." Rose's heart shattered as she rocked the crying child, remembering her own grief when Daniel passed, but Rex seemed to understand something the humans didn't. The dog stood up, walked to the waiting room window, and began wagging his tail. Not the excited wagging of play, but the gentle rhythm of hope. Dr. Vance emerged from the surgical suite at 11:23 p.m., her scrubs stained, but her expression cautiously optimistic. The surgery had been touch and go, with Sarah's blood pressure crashing twice, but they had managed to repair the internal bleeding and stabilize her condition. "She's alive," Dr. Vance announced to the small group gathered in the waiting room. "Critical, but stable. The next 24 hours will tell us everything." Grace's tear-streaked face looked up at the doctor with desperate hope. "Can Rex see her? He helped save her before." The request violated every hospital protocol, but Dr. Vance found herself nodding. After everything this child and her extraordinary dog had endured together, conventional rules seemed insignificant compared to the healing power of love and loyalty. As they prepared to visit Sarah's ICU room, Grace whispered to Rex one more time, Mommy needs to know the bad people can't hurt us anymore. The ICU room was dimly lit, filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines that measured Sarah Anderson's tenuous hold on life. Grace approached her mother's bedside with Rex padding silently beside her, the German Shepherd's presence somehow making the sterile environment feel less frightening. Sarah's face was pale against the white pillows, but her eyes fluttered open when she heard her daughter's voice. "Mommy," Grace whispered, taking her mother's hand with careful gentleness. "Rex helped me tell everyone the truth about Daddy. The bad people can't hurt us anymore." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter, the child who had been silent for 2 years and had now found the courage to expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond their small family's tragedy. Her voice was barely audible through the oxygen mask, but her words carried the weight of a mother's infinite love. "My brave girl," Sarah managed to say. "Daddy would be so proud of you." But even as this tender reunion unfolded, the investigation that Grace's testimony had triggered was revealing truths that would shake the foundations of law enforcement across 3 states. FBI agent Santos had spent the night coordinating with federal prosecutors, and the evidence they were uncovering painted a picture of corruption so extensive that it required a complete restructuring of how they approached the case. The breakthrough came when investigators finally cracked Webb's encrypted communications. Hidden within seemingly innocent legal correspondence were coded messages that revealed the true scope of his criminal network. Webb hadn't been acting alone. He was part of an organized crime syndicate that had systematically infiltrated police departments, targeting officers who posed threats to their operations. Judge Sullivan received the briefing in her chambers at dawn, her coffee growing cold as Agent Santos laid out evidence that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "Your Honor, we've identified at least 15 police officers whose deaths need to be reinvestigated. Webb's organization wasn't just stealing insurance money. They were eliminating law enforcement personnel who had gotten too close to exposing their activities." The judge's hands trembled as she reviewed the files. Among the victims was Officer David Chen, whose suicide 3 years earlier had devastated his young wife and twin daughters. Chen had been investigating drug trafficking routes that, according to the newly discovered evidence, were protected by corrupt officials within his own department. "How many families?" Judge Sullivan asked, though she dreaded the answer. 43 confirmed so far," Santos replied grimly. Wives, children, parents, all told their loved ones died in accidents or by their own hand when they were actually murdered for trying to do their jobs with integrity. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Police officers had sworn to protect and serve, only to be killed by the very system they had dedicated their lives to upholding. Their families had been left not only grieving but financially devastated, as the insurance benefits that should have provided security were systematically stolen by the criminals their loved ones had died trying to stop. Meanwhile, Webb's attempt to negotiate a plea deal was falling apart as evidence mounted against him. His lawyer, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the charges, had requested a meeting with federal prosecutors to discuss cooperation in exchange for leniency, but Webb's position grew weaker by the hour as investigators uncovered bank records, communications, and witness testimony that painted him as a key architect of the conspiracy rather than a reluctant participant. The turning point came when Rose Patterson provided investigators with more of Daniel's hidden files, documents that proved Webb had been targeting Officer Anderson specifically because of his investigation into evidence tampering. Daniel had suspected that evidence from major drug busts was being manipulated or destroyed, allowing high-level dealers to escape prosecution. Jim Anderson had been working with Daniel to expose this corruption when he was murdered. Daniel was getting close to the truth, Rose explained to Agent Santos, her voice heavy with grief and anger. He kept saying something was rotten in the department, that good officers were being set up to fail or worse. Jim Anderson was one of the few people Daniel trusted completely. The conspiracy reached even higher than anyone had imagined. District Attorney Robert Kellerman, who had been overseeing prosecutions for 8 years, was arrested at his home on federal charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and accessory to murder. His office had been systematically dismissing cases against protected criminals while pursuing aggressive prosecutions against officers who threatened to expose the corruption. As the arrests continued throughout the week, Grace remained at her mother's bedside, with Rex providing constant comfort and companionship. The hospital staff had made an exception to their pet policy, recognizing that the dog's presence was essential to both Grace's emotional stability and Sarah's recovery. Nurses reported that Sarah's vital signs improved noticeably whenever Rex was in the room, as if the dog's calming presence had genuine therapeutic value. The media attention was overwhelming, with news crews from across the country descending on the small town of Millbrook. Grace's story had captured the nation's imagination, a 3-year-old girl and her therapy dog bringing down a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. But Rose Patterson and Judge Sullivan worked together to shield Grace from the media circus, understanding that the child needed time to heal rather than publicity. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that Webb's network had been planning to eliminate Grace and Sarah if the trial had proceeded normally. Richard Morrison's assault on Sarah hadn't been random violence. It was a calculated attempt to silence the Anderson family permanently. Morrison himself, facing life in prison, finally agreed to cooperate with authorities and revealed the extent of the conspiracy against the Anderson family. They knew the kid might remember something eventually, Morrison confessed during his videotaped testimony. Webb said it was just a matter of time before she started talking, and when she did, it would bring everything down. The plan was to make it look like Sarah couldn't handle being a single mother and that she hurt herself and the kid. The cold-blooded nature of the plot, targeting a traumatized child and her struggling mother, brought even hardened investigators to tears. Grace's courage in speaking up hadn't just solved her father's murder, it had literally saved her own life and her mother's. As Sarah's condition stabilized over the following days, she learned the full extent of what her daughter's testimony had accomplished. The insurance money that Webb had stolen, not just from their family but from dozens of others, was being recovered through asset forfeiture. The $500,000 that should have secured Grace's future was finally being released, along with punitive damages that would ensure the little girl's education and security for life. But more importantly, the truth about Jim Anderson's character was finally being revealed. He hadn't been a tired officer who fell asleep at the wheel. He had been a hero who died trying to expose corruption and protect other families from the criminals who had ultimately killed him. His sacrifice had meaning, and his daughter's courage had ensured that meaning would not be forgotten. Webb's final attempt at redemption came in the form of a complete confession, detailing every aspect of the conspiracy in exchange for life in prison rather than the death penalty. His testimony implicated corrupt officials across 3 states and provided closure for dozens of families who had spent years wondering why their loved ones had died. "I want that little girl to know," Webb said during his final interrogation, his voice broken by the weight of his crimes, "that her father was everything a police officer should be. Jim Anderson died because he couldn't be bought or intimidated. He died because he was good." The confession brought a bittersweet sense of justice to the Anderson family. Grace, sitting beside her recovering mother with Rex's head in her lap, listened as Agent Santos explained that all the bad people who had hurt their family were going to prison forever. "Rex knew all along," Grace said simply. "Dogs always know who the good people are and who the bad ones are. That's why Rex liked Daddy and didn't like the man with the shiny watch." As the legal proceedings drew to a close, the true scope of Grace's impact became clear. Her courage in speaking the truth had not only solved her father's murder, but had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had claimed dozens of lives and destroyed countless families. A 3-year-old girl and her loyal dog had accomplished what years of investigation by trained professionals had failed to achieve. The bond between Grace and Rex had proven to be more than therapeutic. It had been transformative, giving voice to truth and bringing justice to those who had been silenced by corruption and violence. 1 year later, the Anderson family's modest backyard had been transformed into something that resembled a small piece of heaven. Grace, now 4 years old and chattering constantly to make up for her 2 years of silence, sat cross-legged on a colorful blanket reading a picture book to Rex and his 3 puppies. The German Shepherd lay contentedly in the afternoon sun, his brown eyes watchful but peaceful as his offspring tumbled around Grace's small form. The insurance settlement had allowed Sarah to purchase a 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood where children's laughter echoed from nearby yards, and the biggest concern was whether the sprinklers would reach all corners of the garden. Sarah had completed her nursing degree with honors, specializing in trauma recovery, a field where her own experience with loss and healing gave her an almost supernatural ability to connect with patients who had lost hope. Once upon a time, Grace read carefully from her favorite book, there was a brave knight who had a faithful dog companion. Together they traveled the kingdom helping people who couldn't help themselves. Rex's tail thumped gently against the grass, as if he understood every word of the story that had become their evening ritual. The memorial garden in the corner of the yard was Grace's favorite place to talk to her father. Jim Anderson's police badge, recovered from Webb's safe during the investigation, sat beneath a glass dome atop a granite stone that read, Officer James Michael Anderson, Father, Hero, Guardian of Truth. Grace had insisted on adding the toy police car he had given her for her 2nd birthday, the same car she had clutched during those dark months of silence. Rose Patterson, now 77 and officially adopted as Grace's grandmother by choice, if not by blood, tended the roses that surrounded the memorial with the devotion of someone who understood that love transcends biological connections. Her arthritis had worsened over the past year, but she claimed that chasing after Rex's puppies was better than any physical therapy the doctors could prescribe. "Grandma Rose," Grace called out, looking up from her book. "Do you think Rex's puppies will be as smart as their daddy?" Rose smiled as she watched one of the puppies, a female they had named Hope, demonstrate the same protective instincts that had made Rex legendary. Hope had already shown remarkable aptitude during her early therapy dog training, seeming to inherit not just her father's intelligence, but his extraordinary ability to sense human emotional distress. "Sweetheart," Rose replied, settling onto the blanket beside Grace, "I think those puppies are going to help a lot of children find their voices, just like Rex helped you find yours." The impact of Grace's testimony had rippled far beyond their small family. The Grace Anderson law had been passed in California, establishing legal protections for child witnesses and mandating the availability of therapy animals during testimony in cases involving minors. 12 other states had adopted similar legislation, and Grace's story had become a case study in law schools across the country. Judge Catherine Sullivan had postponed her retirement to establish the Sullivan Center for Victim Advocacy, a nonprofit organization that provided support services for families affected by police corruption and violent crime. The center's therapy dog program, inspired by Rex's work with Grace, had placed trained animals with over 200 families, creating a network of healing that stretched across the nation. "You know," Judge Sullivan said during her weekly visit to the Anderson home, "I've been on the bench for 41 years now, and I've never seen justice served in quite the way it was in that courtroom. Grace didn't just expose a criminal conspiracy. She reminded all of us that truth has a voice, even when that voice belongs to someone very small." The financial recovery had been extraordinary. Webb's criminal network had stolen over $15 million from police families across 3 states, and the federal government's asset forfeiture had recovered nearly all of it. The Anderson family received not only Jim's original insurance benefit but additional damages that ensured Grace's college education and provided Sarah with the financial security to pursue her nursing career without the crushing burden of multiple jobs. More importantly, the recovered funds had allowed the establishment of the Officer James Anderson Memorial Foundation, which provided college scholarships for children of fallen police officers and funded therapy dog programs in hospitals and courts nationwide. Grace had insisted that Rex be named the foundation's official mascot, a title he wore with dignified acceptance. The criminal trials had concluded with sentences that reflected the magnitude of the conspiracy. Marcus Webb received life in prison without possibility of parole, while his co-conspirators faced sentences ranging from 25 years to life. Richard Morrison, who had cooperated fully with authorities, received a reduced sentence of 15 years, but would spend the rest of his life knowing that his violence had nearly destroyed an innocent family. Perhaps most satisfying was the exposure of the broader corruption network. District Attorney Robert Kellerman received a life sentence for his role in the conspiracy, while 7 other officials faced federal charges that effectively dismantled the criminal organization. The investigation had led to the creation of new oversight mechanisms for police departments and prosecutors' offices, ensuring that the kind of systematic corruption Webb had exploited could never again operate with impunity. Sarah often reflected on the strange twists of fate that had led to their current happiness. If Grace hadn't found the courage to speak to Rex, if the dog hadn't responded with such protective loyalty, if Rose Patterson hadn't preserved Daniel's investigative notes, any break in that chain of events might have left the truth buried forever. "Sometimes I think Jim is still watching over us," Sarah confided to Rose one evening as they watched Grace play with the puppies. "It's like he knew somehow that Rex would be exactly what Grace needed to find her voice again." Rose nodded, her own faith strengthened by witnessing the profound connection between the child and dog. Daniel always said that Rex had a gift for reading people's hearts. I think when Rex met Grace, he recognized a kindred spirit, someone who had lost everything but refused to let that loss destroy their capacity for love. The therapy dog program Rex had inspired was expanding rapidly. Hope, his most promising offspring, had already been placed with a 6-year-old boy whose father had been killed in the line of duty. The other puppies were in training to work with traumatized children across the state, carrying forward the legacy of healing that their father had begun. Grace's own development had been remarkable. The shy, traumatized child who had spent 2 years in silence had blossomed into a confident, articulate little girl who spoke frequently about wanting to become a police officer like her father when she grew up. Child psychologists marveled at her resilience, attributing her recovery to the stability provided by her family, the justice achieved through her testimony, and most importantly, her ongoing relationship with Rex. "Rex taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Grace explained to a documentary filmmaker who was creating a film about therapy animals. "It means you do the right thing even when you are scared, because someone you love is counting on you." As the sun set over their peaceful neighborhood, Grace curled up against Rex's warm side for their nightly routine of story time and conversation. The dog listened patiently as she told him about her day at preschool, her plans for tomorrow's play date, and her dreams of following in her father's footsteps as a protector of truth and justice. "Thank you, Rex," Grace whispered into his fur, words she spoke every night before sleep. "Thank you for helping me remember that Daddy was a hero, and that heroes never really go away. They just live on in the people who love them." Rex's gentle woof of acknowledgment seemed to carry the wisdom of years, the understanding that love and loyalty could indeed triumph over even the darkest forces of corruption and violence. In finding his purpose through protecting Grace, he had fulfilled the highest calling of his species, the unwavering devotion that transforms ordinary animals into extraordinary guardians of the human heart. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices, and the greatest courage emerges from the deepest pain. Grace Anderson's story reminds us that even when life strips away everything we hold dear, our loved ones, our security, our very ability to speak, the human spirit possesses an extraordinary capacity to heal and triumph. Through her bond with Rex, a therapy dog who understood loss as deeply as she did, Grace found not just her voice but the strength to seek justice for countless families who had suffered in silence. Her journey from a traumatized, mute child to a brave advocate for truth demonstrates that healing often comes through unexpected connections, and that loyalty, whether human or canine, can literally save lives. The Anderson family's transformation from victims of tragedy to champions of justice shows us that our darkest moments can become the foundation for our greatest contributions. Grace's courage didn't just solve her father's murder. It created a legacy of hope that continues to heal broken families across the nation. In a world that often feels overwhelming, her story proves that love, truth, and unwavering determination can still overcome even the most entrenched corruption and evil. Have you ever experienced an unexpected friendship that helped you through your darkest hour? What qualities do you think made the bond between Grace and Rex so powerful in bringing truth to light? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear about the connections that have shaped your own journey.